Hey everyone, welcome to my video on the aggregate demand aggregate supply model. Over the last few videos, I've spent a lot of time explaining these three different graphs to you, and in this video, I'm going to combine them. It's going to be a little bit longer than the other ones because we're going to hit this model from a lot of different angles.
So let's start with talking about short-run equilibrium. Short-run equilibrium is just when the short-run aggregate supply curve meets the aggregate demand curve. And on this graph, the short-run equilibrium then is the intersection of that x. Now I do want to point out, for the sake of vocab, I'm going to often use the y star, and y star denotes the current or short-term level of GDP. And the price level associated with that is the actual price level in the economy. Okay, so let's look at what happens in this economy if net exports changes, or anything else that could affect aggregate demand. Net exports changes, that's an increase in aggregate demand, so we'll draw that by shifting the aggregate demand to the right. Now when we do, if we really wanted to go back and think of our aggregate expenditures model, the aggregate demand is aggregate expenditures, the short-run aggregate supply is the actual production and output. So in a very real sense, this would be an unplanned decrease in inventories. I think that might be more of a distraction than a help, but it is a connection between the two models. But one thing that will help us with this model is just to point out that this means that the GDP is going to rise. Y star 1 increases to Y star 2. More production than before. And of course I can move any curve we want to, aggregate demand or short-run aggregate supply, and if we move it around we'll change the price level and the GDP and all that. But this one, we increased production. Now let's talk about long-run equilibrium. Long-run equilibrium is when aggregate demand equals short-run aggregate supply equals long-run aggregate supply. So if you look at it on a graph, there's your long-run aggregate supply at potential GDP, there's the short-run aggregate supply, and there's the aggregate demand curve. We are in long-run equilibrium if the x of our short-run equilibrium is on the long-run supply curve. So y star is in the same place as potential output. This dot here in the middle is the sweet spot. Short-run aggregate supply meets aggregate demand, that's the short-run equilibrium. If your short-run equilibrium happens to be on the long-run aggregate supply curve, then you're in long-run equilibrium. Also, we could just say y star is equal to potential GDP. That GDP is potential GDP. That would be saying we're in long-run equilibrium. If you're in this position, then your prices meet short-run and long-run conditions. Expected input prices are proportionate to actual output prices or final prices. We have price stability. There is no incentive for this economy to change. Now, we have three options though, because we're not always in equilibrium. We could have the x be to the left of potential GDP. We can have the x on potential GDP, or we can have the x to the right of potential GDP. Those are our three basic options. No matter how you draw the graph, it has to look like one of these. And let's analyze a little bit of what these things mean. If actual GDP is less than our potential GDP, versus y star equals y bar, versus y star being greater than y bar, see in the purple, this is what we call a negative output gap. Our output is less than our potential. The gap between them we call negative. It's a negative output gap. We also can call that a recessionary gap because our GDP is so low. For the green, there is no output gap. Y star equals y bar. For the orange, it's a positive output gap because we're producing more than potential GDP. We also call this an inflationary gap, and I'll explain why in a little bit, but basically, in order for the economy to fix itself, you're going to get some inflation. Back to purple. GDP is low, and so our unemployment will be higher than the natural rate. The natural rate is what happens at y bar. If we're producing less than that, then we have fewer workers, the unemployment rate will be higher. In the green, the unemployment rate is the natural rate of unemployment. And in the orange, the unemployment rate is less than the natural rate of unemployment. We can start to see a pretty good picture of how these things match our business cycle, because it's all about how GDP relates to potential GDP. So let's draw a business cycle actually. Let's put a Y bar that is growing over time, and let's also put a cycle going around it. And how do the different pieces equate? Well, Y star is whatever is on that squiggly GDP line. The green line is potential GDP. Orange was when Y star was higher than potential GDP, which is all of these spaces. Anytime your GDP is higher than potential, you're in that positive output gap or the inflationary gap. All of these orange spaces are positive output gaps because GDP, Y star, is greater than potential GDP, Y bar. Likewise, if GDP is less than Y bar, then all these purple areas are the negative output gaps or the recessionary gaps. Now let's move forward. Instead of just talking about the mechanics of the model, let's talk about changing the model. So let's start in long run equilibrium and then increase aggregate demand and see what happens. So let's get our long run equilibrium up here. Aggregate demand, aggregate supply, then we increase aggregate demand. What happens? First thing we should note, the short run equilibrium moves from A to B. Our GDP is going to rise, and so is our price level. Notice B is farther up than A as well. The gap between the GDP at B and the potential GDP at A is an inflationary gap. And because of this inflationary gap, we expect to see a gradual price increase. Where does it come from? Well, it comes from the fact that our actual price level at B, which measures the price of final goods and services, is different and higher than the price level at point A, which is our expected input price level. Our expectations are going to adjust to reality, and the reality is that our expectations at price level A are less than the actual prices at price level B. And so as prices are allowed to adjust, firms will start raising wages and prices. And as they do that, the short-run aggregate supply curve will decrease. As they raise their wages and other prices to meet these expectations, as input cost rises, the short-run aggregate supply will decrease. Okay? That's going to look like this, which has a new short-run equilibrium on AD2 and AS2. That's point C here. And so we're going to move to this point C with this higher price level and the same potential GDP. The economy eventually moves from B to C. Y star will fall then. The inflationary gap will close. No more gap. And the price level will rise. Now, why do we call it an inflationary gap when Y star is greater than Y bar? Well, it's obvious. In order for it to correct, the price level had to increase. And if you increase the aggregate price level, that's positive inflation. In order for economy to self-correct in an inflationary gap, you're going to get some inflation. Cool. There's one example for an increase in aggregate demand. Let's do something else. Let's say we start with we're in equilibrium and then aggregate demand falls. I'll go through this one a little faster. There's equilibrium. Aggregate demand falls. We wind up at this new point B, from A to B. And at point B, we can say that the price level and GDP have decreased and that we are in a recessionary gap. And so from there, our actual prices are less than what we expected. And so as prices get less sticky, as they are allowed to adjust, we're going to adjust our expectations downward. Prices are going to fall, or input prices are going to fall, which will increase the short run aggregate supply curve. And so it's going to move to the right, eventually reaching point C. Now I should note that whenever I move these short run aggregate supply curves, they don't have to move all the way at once. There could be lots and lots of little ones along the way between points B and C. That just makes for a messy graph, so I just draw it as if it shifts all the way at once, even if that's not necessarily how it is. Notice in both of these cases, when the aggregate demand moved, the thing that corrected our economy, the self-correcting mechanism, was the changing of the short-run aggregate supply curve. The short-run aggregate supply curve moves until you get back to equilibrium. I have this story about actual prices and expected prices. Some teachers tell an actual story about wages. During recessions, wages fall. During inflationary gaps, wages rise. Whatever. But if you're just looking for a rule of thumb, you got two supply curves. The short run supply curve is going to move around until you get to equilibrium. Let's do something else real quick. What if you're in equilibrium and the short run aggregate supply curve decreases? What then? Okay, so here's our equilibrium, and then we decrease the short run aggregate supply curve from A to B. Lower GDP, we're in a recessionary gap, we have higher price level, and this is the short run movement. It happens all at once. Inflation is going to be going up, GDP is going to be going down, unemployment is going to be going up. Our price level is less than our expected price level. Expected price level being where the two supply curves meet, and the price level being where the short run supply and the aggregate demand meet. And that means we've overestimated our price level. And so once again, input prices are going to fall, which will increase the short run aggregate supply. And we're going to just slide back along down to point A. Aggregate supply 3 will look like short run aggregate supply 1. That's our transition to the long run. If you move the supply curve, it'll just move back. And so we wind up back where we started. Now, I should point out that this situation with rising inflation and unemployment is nasty. So nasty we give it a name, stagflation, high unemployment and high inflation. That, I will show you soon, gives our policymakers a really nasty dilemma. And we will unpack that in another video. And then last, if the short run aggregate supply increases, it's just going to move back too. You'd start here, you'd go to aggregate supply 2, and then you'd go back to point A. So from A to B, back to A again. Alright, I know that was a lot. I hope you're able to go back and make some sense of it. But that's the model in a nutshell. We're going to use this model to analyze our economic policies, to stabilize the business cycle. Once again, we usually leave the long run aggregate supply and the long run aggregate supply and the aggregate demand curve constant, unless I specify something in the problem that changes them. But the short run aggregate supply curve is moving to bring us to equilibrium. Anyway, I hope it's helpful, guys. I'm gonna go to sleep. Take it easy.